Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi. Today we're going to be talking about burning. Now you might be thinking, wowza, Jeff, why? Why would you waste my time with this garbage reaction? Well, burning isn't great, but there are a few things about burning that aren't that bad either. And most importantly, with Nahida, we now have a way to apply enough off-field dendro to basically maintain burning forever. So the baseline duration of burning is 2 seconds-ish, because it's basically just 2 seconds per unit of dendro you apply, and usually you apply 1 unit of dendro. However, when it comes to Nahida, she applies 1.5 units of dendro with her Trikarma proc, which means that it lasts for 3 seconds instead. And her Trikarma proc can happen once every 2.5 seconds, which means you can have 100% uptime on it. Now, is that enough to make burning good by itself? Not really. Having a lot of burning uptime is cool and all, but the damage on burning, once you've built, like, the general max amount of EM that you can get on your character is gonna hover around 1,000, maybe a little bit more with Gilded Dreams, maybe up to like 1,200. Now, with your Elemental Mastery multiplier, your ticks can be at 1,200 EM, 2,500, multiplied by 1.15 if you have VV, and 0.9 if you don't, which is a DPS of almost 12,000, which from a reaction itself is pretty good actually, but it's nothing crazy. But most importantly, it kind of limits the options in terms of what exactly you can be doing in terms of like the units you put on your team, because if you trigger reactions other than burning, you can remove the burning and then you don't have this damage. And with that in mind, 12,000 DPS is not really that much, right? Like it's okay, but if it's the main source of damage on your team is gonna struggle, because teams at like mid to high investment can generally reach upwards of 50 to 60k relatively easily. Upwards of 50 to 60k DPS is generally what you would expect out of a solid team in the content that they're good at. Sometimes DPS can be lower and you can still have things that make up for it, but point being, right, this isn't enough to carry a team by itself. You need to also have other forms of damage. So, in this video, we're basically going to be talking about the kind of stuff you can put on your team to have other forms of damage where you still actually benefit from the burning reaction and you still actually get some damage out of burning. There's basically going to be like 3 different things you can try to go for. I guess 4, because I don't really consider it a burning team, but anytime you have Burgeon on your team, it's kind of a burning team because sometimes you'll trigger burning. But like if you're mainly focusing on Burgeon, you won't have good burning uptime, so it doesn't really matter. And so because of that, I'm not really gonna talk about those teams, but it is I guess a thing that you can keep in mind. But the main 3 I want to focus on is, right, because you start with Dendro, you start with Pyro. Adding a Geo unit doesn't change anything, right, because it doesn't react. You'll trigger Crystallize, you'll weaken your burning aura a little bit, but you're not really gonna, it's not gonna change much, basically. And Hydro units is generally gonna be Burgeon teams. So that leaves us with 3 other possible elements that you can add to your team that can actually change the nature of the team. You'll have Electro, you'll have Anemo, and you'll have Cryo. So when it comes to Cryo, you can trigger melt reactions. And because burning puts a lot of pyro on the enemies, the burning reaction can actually help you get more reliable reverse melts with your Cryo units. So that's one of the three things you can do with burning, right? So you can do burning plus melt. The second thing is going to be with an Electro unit. So because of the way that burning works, when you trigger burning, you can use the burning on the enemies to trigger overload. And if you remove the burning and you put Electro on the enemy and then you apply pyro on them, you'll trigger overload as well. The thing is, as a baseline like that, that's just that, yeah, I mean, of course, that's how reactions work. But with Electro specifically, there's actually a few more things that can happen. At a baseline, if you trigger a burning reaction, and then you apply Electro to it, you get overloaded, and that's it. However, if you quicken the enemy and then apply Pyro on them, and so you burn with Quicken instead of burning with Dendro, you can actually get overloaded and aggravate. So the burning is going to eat at your Dendro aura, or your Quicken aura. Once that aura runs out, burning stops. But while the enemy is burning, they still have that aura, which means if you're applying a lot of Electro, you can actually get a bunch of aggravates while the enemies are burning. Another mechanic that can be interesting is that if you have an enemy with Quicken aura and underlying Electro, like this, your Pyro attack will overload it and start burning, Which means that effectively, if you have a really fast Electro and enough Dendro, every single time you hit them with Pyro, your Pyro is going to trigger Overloaded, and then you can use the Burning to trigger more Overloaded. But because of the previous mechanic we looked at, even while you're doing that, you're not losing Aggravates. Which means that when you add a Pyro unit into an Aggravate team, they're not actually going to yoink your damage. They're not going to yoink your Aggravates. You're basically just gaining free reactions. So, for example, pretty basic Sino team, right? Usually you'd add something like Zhongli here. But if you don't have Zhongli, or if you just don't want to play him, you can replace him with someone like Toma. Now, obviously, if you want to maximize damage, you're going to want to build him full EM, but you don't have to. You can just build him for his shield, and you still get bonus damage out of the overloads, and you get a strong shield. I'm just going to build him full EM because I can't be bothered. I did it before I was supposed to. Anyways, you can see that there is a difference in damage. It is actually increasing the speed at which we kill the Primo Vishat by a pretty significant amount. And I mean, that's relevant. That's very relevant. It is actually enough to justify a slot on an Aggravate team. It's not gonna be the best possible option you can go for, but it is a viable one, and it's worth considering. So one thing that can be important to know about is that Overload has a global internal cooldown where you won't always get the damage when you trigger Overload. If you trigger Overload within I think it's 0.1, I think it's 0.15. I'm not 100% sure exactly what the number is, but if you trigger Overloaded like very close together, you're gonna get 2 explosions, but you're only gonna get 1 instance of Overloaded damage. Because of that, when you play teams like these, where you apply a lot of Electro and a lot of Pyro, or not that much, but a decent amount of Pyro, you actually can end up in situations where you lose damage from your overloads. Or not that you lose damage, but that you don't get overloaded damage that you otherwise could have had. Because Official Ascension 4 hits the enemy when you trigger a reaction, you're actually not going to be able to get 2 overloads, one from Oz and one from your other Electro unit, with the burning stuff like this. I do this, then I do this, then I do this. I'll only get 1 overloaded, even though I remove my Pyro because Fischl's Ascension 4 proc, so I triggered 2 overloads. Without Fischl's Oz on the field, if you do the same thing, you won't remove your Pyro, the enemy will keep burning, and you'll lose your Dendro. So you can tell that it did get a second overload, the second overload just didn't deal damage. Now, I've talked about this in a video before, but some things aren't registered exactly at the same place when it comes to the server, where some things are registered like on your side, on your client side, right? And some things are registered server side. I'm not a fucking computer nerd, so I don't understand exactly like why and like specifically which things and whatever. I haven't looked into it enough. But the concept of client side versus server side is it's basically why when you have high ping, you can still move without it feeling weird. But if you try to swap, it's gonna take a while. Because moving is an action that happens client side, whereas swapping is an action that happens server side. Hitting an enemy with an attack is something that happens client side. But proccing Beidou's burst when you hit an enemy is something that happens server side. Which means that if you have high ping, Beidou's burst will actually hit a bit later than usual. Now the reason why this matters here is because it can actually hit later enough that it changes whether or not you get your stuff. If I do the same setup, I'll only get 1 overload. But if I go to my Taiwan account, I get 2 overloads. And so on this account, I get 2 overloads, whereas on my main account, I only get 1. And the reason for that is because I have higher ping. Which means that if you're using Beidou with an on-field Electro unit, you'll actually get more damage with higher ping. It's not that big of a deal, but it is funny. But yeah, by the way, the reason why just triggering 1 overload doesn't remove the burning is because burning is always going to be 2 units. The underlying pyro will not be 2 units, but the burning itself will. So if I trigger 2 overloads, it's going to remove the pyro and I'll be left with my dendro. One thing that's very interesting when it comes to Nahida specifically. So usually when you apply 1 unit of dendro and you trigger pyro, burning, you overload, at the end, there's not going to be anything left. Because under your 2 units of burning, you only have 1 unit of pyro. Which means that if you overloaded, you remove that, right? If you trigger overloaded, you remove that underlying unit of pyro. And so once the burning expires, there's no pyro. But burning itself actually applies pyro. The thing is, it only applies pyro every 2 seconds. When you only apply 1 unit of dendro, your burning lasts less than 2 seconds. Which means that you don't reapply it after the initial reaction. But when you apply 1.5 units instead with Nahida's E, it lasts more than 2 seconds, which means that it actually has time to reapply the underlying pyro so that you can actually get your burning. Right, so that was the second thing. So burning plus overload. But it's not really just burning plus overload, it's burning plus overload plus aggravate. And then finally, your last option, burning plus swirl. One of the reasons why you don't want to just have burning as your main source of damage is that if you do that and you don't actually use other reactions, A, your burning DPS isn't going to be that good, but also, you're going to share your burning ownership between your pyro and dendro units. Because you can only have pyro and dendro units, so all of the units that are hitting the enemies are pyro and dendro. Which means that there's not going to be 1 unit that gets most of the burning, which means that if you actually build for the burning damage, you're going to have to build all 4 of your units with full EM, and then they won't do any talent damage. So that's just not a lot of damage. Or you just focus on their talent damage, and then burning doesn't do that much damage because 3 of your units don't have EM, and most of the burning is owned by those 3 because there's no 1 unit that's getting more than a half. When it comes to burning plus swirl, when it comes to using Anemo units, your Anemo units generally want to build full EM anyways, just because of their swirl damage. And so because of that, your burning ownership doesn't matter because all of your units are building EM, whether they want burning or not. And then you can have 1 unit that isn't built for EM, and then maybe they'll get a little bit of burning ownership, like one of your pyro units, for example. But because it's only 1 unit that isn't built for EM, you're not losing that much damage like on your burning itself. So what I'm leading up to with this is teams that use obviously swirl and burning, so you need dendro, pyro, and Anemo. But your last slot is generally going to be either a second pyro or a second Anemo unit. I don't really like going for double dendro because you don't actually gain anything from the second dendro unit. Our current dendro units are mainly focused on their reactions, and their base damages aren't very good other than Nahida, which means that if you have Nahida on your team, getting a second dendro unit just doesn't matter. They're not actually adding much to the team. Technati can have a decent amount of personal damage, but because he's mostly single target, it's like, eh. And if you're going to be playing a Technati team without aggravate, his personal damage isn't even that good either. So, as a general rule, with the currently available dendro units, I don't like running double dendro. So it leaves us with double pyro and double Anemo. One thing that is very important to keep in mind when it comes to burning is that burning has a very, very, very small AoE. When I trigger burning on one enemy, whatever, very cool, right? It doesn't have much of an AoE, but it does have a very small AoE, and it can actually hit more than one enemy. But more importantly, for the point I'm getting at right now, it can also hit you. And so if you're not careful with your burning,
time to go. Not bad.
You're gonna die. Because unlike Burgeon and Hyperbloom, burning does not do reduced self-damage. For Burgeon and Hyperbloom and Bloom, right, because Hyperbloom does have a very small AoE as well, it's just very, very small, so most of the time you don't notice it. They can do self-damage, but the self-damage is divided by 20. You only take 5%. But for burning, that's not the case. Which means that you will die, and you will die fast, because enemies are not that squishy compared to you, right? These enemies, like very light enemies, have like a fucking 80k or more HP. You will die to the burning a lot faster than they do. The difference in HP between like the enemies and your characters is so big. It's not that burning is like that much damage, it's that on you, it does so much damage that you can actually die inside of Bennett Burst.
This is the end.
You can die through Zhongli's shield, you can die through Toma's shield, you can basically die through anything. Now, one of the reasons for that is because Burning's AoE actually makes it so that if you have two enemies that are burning close to you, you take the burning damage twice. One thing that is very, very hard to confirm because the game doesn't actually always put on your screen all the numbers that it registers, but Burning seems to also be able to hit other enemies with that AoE, but if two enemies are burning, it seems that they can both take each other's burning damage on top of their own. I'm not entirely sure what the prerequisite for that to happen is because it doesn't look like it's always happens, but I have noticed that I very consistently kill enemies faster than I should if that wasn't the case when they're grouped together with an Anemo unit. I'll show actually trying the team properly. And you can see, yeah, they actually do die pretty fast. Effectively, what's happening here is because you can reliably keep your pyro aura on the enemies with burning, it helps you get your swirls more reliably, and because you're playing a team with groupers and AoE content, swirl does more damage, that seemingly somewhat quadratic scaling on burning is putting in some work as well, and you just end up getting a solid amount of damage. However, the main important thing for a team like this, in my opinion, and the main thing that made me decide to actually make a video on burning instead of just talking about it a little bit on my stream, is that as long as you apply pyro to all the enemies once you've done this, you trigger a reaction on literally one of the enemies. Oh, fuck. You trigger a reaction, bro! Trigger a reaction on one of the enemies and they all start burning. No matter how close or far away they are from each other, because Nahida's E keeps the mark on all of them, burning doesn't remove the pyro from the enemies. So once burning is over, they still have pyro on them. And if you trigger a reaction on one of them, it'll apply dendro to all of them from Nahida's E, so it keeps the burning going. I think that's very relevant because it means that no matter if the enemies are groupable or not, even if the enemies end up deciding to ungroup themselves, even if they decide to fucking walk to the other end of the chamber, it doesn't really matter, and you can still effectively have a portion of your damage that is consolidated in AoE even when the enemies are not grouped. To me, that's very relevant because one of the biggest obstacles to clearing your chambers in time is consolidating your AoE well. That's a pretty big deal because, right, I said earlier, right, teams pretty often end up having 50, 60k DPS without too much of an issue, but a boss has like 2 million HP. At 50k DPS, 40 seconds and he's dead. But you have 90 seconds per chamber. The biggest obstacle to clearing in time for most people who do Abyss isn't reaching the DPS check, like just reaching it. It's actually getting your damage to hit the enemies all the time. There's also not dying, obviously, but consolidating your AoE well is a very, very important thing. And the way that with Nahida and burning, you kind of get a pretty solid amount of your damage consolidated no matter what you do, as long as your E hits them, which is like actually hard to miss. Because you can literally just do this and you'll hit every single enemy in the chamber. This is the kind of advantages that a team has that it's not going to show up on like how much DPS it does, but that practically very often will actually matter and very often will make a difference in how fast you're clearing a chamber. In this very chamber, right, the Kairagis, very often, right, if you stand far from them, they do this attack which ungroups them. Right, if I go here, he's going to ungroup. But as long as I keep triggering reactions, he keeps taking damage. even if it's not on him directly. And that makes it so that he just fucking dies. In these chambers, the amount of DPS that you actually need, assuming that your AoE is, or your damage is always hitting the enemies. I mean, we can actually look at it, right? These enemies are level 95. The Eremite has around 180k HP, and the Kaihagi has around 500k HP. Assuming that all the enemies are always taking damage, that's around 700k HP. Considering you have 90 seconds-ish per half, all you need to actually clear the chamber is 8,000 DPS. The thing is, burning by itself, even at only 1000 EM, which is what basically most characters can very easily achieve with Gilded Dreams, you're still higher than that if they're VV'd. If they're not VV'd, you're still over 8k. So just from the burning itself, like burning itself, literally only burning, can clear your chamber in time to 36 star in chambers like these. Which is kind of pretty relevant. Because if all you need to do is fucking watch them and they die, that's pretty cool. Now, obviously, you don't always have chambers like this. A lot of chambers are gonna have bosses where the DPS check becomes higher, but it's a lot easier to consolidate your AoE against chambers that have bosses. All of this to say, while the actual output of Nahida Burning Teams won't always be the highest in terms of DPS, that factor, that advantage that they have is very, very relevant. And it's something that a lot of people will often not necessarily forget about, but a lot of people won't realize how important that can be for more casual players that aren't gonna try to do a perfect rotation and reset until they get a good clear. A lot of people don't realize just how much Venti helps Kazuha. One of Kazuha's biggest issues when it comes to personal damage is that his burst knocks enemies back, and his E against enemies that aren't really vulnerable to like his grouping, but are vulnerable to stagger, will stagger enemies very far away from each other. That means that not only do you not always get the grouping that you want from him, but also when the enemies are staggered away from each other like that, you can actually end up having your swirls not get that like up to 2 target quadratic scaling that they have. When you play him with Venti, you kind of just eliminate that issue altogether because Venti will suck them back in immediately. On top of that, they alleviate each other's energy requirements, which means that you can run a lot less ER and a lot more offensive stats like crit, more EM. The value of weapons like Fav goes down, which makes it easier to get away with using stuff like Iron Sting. They very much benefit from being on the same team. Now, I want to show you something very interesting. What was the difference between the first 2 times and the third time? The difference was I waited a little bit longer, and I actually waited long enough for the underlying power on the enemy to reach less than what's necessary to sustain 1 melt reaction. If instead of Rosaria, I were to use someone like Diona, as you can see, we never lose our underlying pyro. We can melt as often as we can apply cryo. Now, I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this. You can use burning to sustain pyro on the enemies. So, I'm gonna be logging out of my account and logging into someone else's account so I can do some testing with Ganyu. As you can see, right? If we let the burning expire, we can pretty okay, well, not if he does that. Okay, if we let the burning expire, we can very easily keep him burning, trigger, melt as much as we want until Nahida's E expires. However, and as you can see, I lost my pyro. So, we start with Pyro Aura. We trigger Melt, we reduce the Pyro Aura, we trigger Burning, we now have 2 units of Burning. This first bloom will remove some Burning, and we're left with 1.5 units of Burning. With this charge shot, we reduce the Burning to 1 unit, and with this bloom, we reduce the Burning to 0.5 units. And now finally, with this charge shot, as you can see, we don't actually get another burning tick after it happened. After the charge shot, even though we still have a little bit of pyro onto the enemy, the last tick of burning happens on the charge shot, right before it. So effectively, we still have pyro and dendro onto the enemy, but the burning is gone. And because the burning is gone, but we still have a little bit of pyro, we don't have the burning aura to be able to melt off of. Which means that once we remove this pyro, if we don't trigger burning again, it's gone. It's gone forever. It's gone. And so because we did this charge shot before Nahida was able to reapply dendro with her E, the bloom, so here it did 18k. It was a non-crit. Yeah. Non-crit that isn't melted is 9k, which means that it was a melt. But effectively, what ended up happening here is we ran out of burning at the wrong moment. And so we had some pyro on the enemy, but it wasn't burning anymore. And then once we removed that pyro with the bloom, there was no more pyro. And once the pyro's gone, you're gonna need to reapply it. And we don't have any form of off-field pyro with this team, so it's just gone. The reason why it's not always gonna get removed is that if you do it fast enough, you're never gonna end up in a situation where Nahida's E procs on the second hit of the bloom. Or I guess another way that it could run out is if your second charge shot is slow, but your third one is fast. First charge shot, cool. Second charge shot. And that removes it as well. So basically, if an even numbered charge shot is slow, you have to make your next odd numbered charge shot fast. Otherwise, it's gonna fuck up. It's a bit cringe. Actually keeping track of that in real time is very difficult. But the main point is, if you always do them fast, you're not gonna have a problem. If you always do them slow, you're not gonna have a problem. If you do it somewhere in the middle and inconsistently, you're fucked. You can try to practice to always get it fast enough, or what I would actually generally recommend is just take your time. At the end of the day, it won't be that big of a difference if you do them exactly frame perfect or if you just wait a little bit. So you can kind of just wait a little bit and who cares really. Or you can decide to have another form of off-field pyro, like a Kazuha pyro infused burst.
My contract goes unfulfilled. Everybody stand back.
Oh yeah, so this is a rotation you can do. Oh my god. How does anyone enjoy this? Anyways, in situations like that, you have a little bit more flexibility because you have all-field pyro, so it's fine. And that's kind of it. I haven't looked into meld variations for Nahida with cryo units that don't use off-field pyro because my Bennett is C6. So I have off-field pyro even when I don't, just because of Bennett. But there should be ways to make them work as well. One thing though, you are going to have to be careful and make sure that your pillar isn't hitting the enemy, because if your pillar is hitting the enemy, that can fuck with your setups as well. We lost it on literally the second one. Point being, because you're applying Geo, which means you're removing pyro and you're removing burning, or some amount of pyro and burning, it changes around the like timing and it makes it like effectively just not really doable. You can do it still if you just let the burning expire in between all your charge shots. Like it functions, but it slows down your charge shots by actually like a pretty large amount, so it is something to keep in mind. Anyways, that's kind of it for the burning stuff I wanted to talk about with Nahida. So TLDR, or TLDW, I guess. Burning Swirl or Air Fryer. That's right, that's the name. It's Air Fryer and there's nothing you can do about it. So Air Fryer is actually pretty fun because you have a risk of actually dying and it's fun to like actually have to look at what you're doing. But it also has some upside in like brain dead, or not brain dead, but like passively killing all enemies in a chamber, which is nice. And it's also just a pretty like decent baseline. You've got Burning plus Overload, for which I don't quite have a name just yet, or Burning plus Overload plus Aggravate, for which I don't have a name just yet, but just it's coming. You know it's coming. You end up playing your Aggravate team as usual, but you add a pyro unit that doesn't have too fast of an electro application. Sorry, that doesn't have too fast of a pyro application into the mix, and you end up just gaining a bunch of free overloads. And then you can have melt stuff, where in some situations you have to be careful for your timing in order to make sure that your pyro doesn't run out. But if you're careful, you can actually get away without an off-field pyro unit at all, which can be pretty nice because it lets you run a team like this with Zhongli. But yeah, that's basically it. So I hope you learned a thing or two. Burning still sucks overall, even though these teams can actually be pretty good. I don't like it, but hey, it is what it is. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to do the thing, you know. I know who you are, George. Do the thing. Oh yeah, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye. Bro, I hate this. I literally cannot charge attack. I don't have enough time in between his attacks to charge attack. I hate it. How does anyone enjoy this?